There's a moment in real life when someone keeps driving after running a red light, then a second, then a third, and instead of stopping, they roll down the window and say, "I'm still in control." That's where this story begins. Because what happens when the rules are clearly written, clearly understood, and still quietly ignored? What happens when the people who are supposed to enforce the line vote, speak, warn, and the line still gets crossed anyway? This is not a normal hearing. This is not a routine Senate vote. This is a stress test of whether the system still functions when it's pushed right to the edge. Let's set the frame immediately, no delays, no confusion. On March 4th, 2026, the United States Senate voted on a War Powers resolution introduced by Tim Kaine with support from Rand Paul aimed at one specific target: forcing President Donald Trump to seek congressional approval before continuing military action against Iran. The result came back, 53 to 47. The resolution failed. Then, on April 15th, 2026, they tried again, and the result came back again, 52 to 47. Failed. Now listen carefully to what was said and what was not said. Mike Johnson stood in front of cameras and framed the entire situation in one clean sentence. This resolution would empower enemies, weaken U.S. forces, and strip the commander-in-chief of the flexibility needed to protect the country. And then he added the line that sounds harmless, until you look at it closely. We're not at war right now. But here's the contradiction sitting in plain sight. Military operations have already taken place, targets have already been hit, civilian casualties have already been reported. So the question isn't whether something is happening. The question is, what do you call it when force is used, people die, and Congress is bypassed, but it's still not called war? This is where the story shifts out of political commentary and into something much sharper. Because this isn't about one vote. This is about a pattern. 2 votes, 2 failures, same margin range, same outcome, same unresolved tension sitting underneath the surface. And that margin matters more than anything else in this entire story. Because 53 to 47 is not dominance, 52 to 47 is not control. Those are survival numbers. Numbers that say you still have enough support to move forward, but just barely. And in a system built on numbers, barely is not stability. It's a warning signal. Now zoom in closer. 47 senators, almost half the chamber, voted to restrict presidential war powers. Not all Democrats, not purely partisan. That coalition includes a Republican voice like Rand Paul, who didn't shift position for political convenience, but stayed consistent with a long-standing constitutional argument. Congress authorizes war, not the president alone. That matters. Because when opposition comes from inside the same party, it stops being a political disagreement and starts becoming a structural fracture. And fractures don't break systems overnight. They spread, quietly, until one day the numbers flip and what looked like control turns out to have been temporary all along. And this is exactly where the tone changes. Because up to this point you've been watching a political event, now you're looking at a legal record. And once something becomes a record, it stops being opinion and starts becoming evidence. Let's move into prosecutorial mode. The law here is not vague, not symbolic, not open to creative interpretation. It is written in plain text. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 requires the President to notify Congress within 48 hours of deploying armed forces and to obtain authorization within 60 days if those operations continue. That's not a suggestion, that's a boundary. Now place that law next to the timeline. March 4th, 2026, Senate votes 53 to 47 against limiting presidential war powers regarding Iran. April 15th, 2026, Senate votes again, 52 to 47, same outcome. Between those dates, military actions continue, operations don't pause, the system doesn't reset, the activity on the ground does not wait for legal clarity. So the question becomes surgical. If Congress is signaling, twice, that authorization is required, and military activity continues anyway, where exactly does the law sit in that equation? Because here's the contradiction no one addressed directly. On one side, leadership argues that passing the resolution would limit flexibility and interfere with ongoing operations. On the other side, the very existence of those operations is what triggers the requirement for authorization in the first place. You can't say the law is unnecessary because action is happening, when the law exists precisely because action is happening. That's not a policy disagreement. That's a logical loop. Now add another layer of evidence. 47 senators voted in favor of restricting those war powers. 47. That number is not random. It is larger than the threshold required to block future expansions of executive authority under Senate procedural rules, which means something critical. There is already a functional minority in place that can resist, stall, and eventually reshape the outcome if the margins shift even slightly. And margins are already shifting. 53 to 47 becomes 52 to 47. That's not stability, that's erosion. Slow, measurable, undeniable erosion. Now let's examine the language again, because language is where intent hides. We're not at war right now. That sentence does two things at once. It lowers the perceived urgency, while avoiding the legal trigger word that would demand accountability. Because once you call something war, the clock starts ticking. The reporting requirements activate. The authorization requirement becomes unavoidable. So instead, the situation is framed as limited, contained, manageable. But none of those words appear in the law. The law doesn't ask whether the operation feels limited. It asks whether force has been used. And force has been used. That's not disputed. That's documented. So now you have the full structure laid out like a case file. A law that defines clear limits. A timeline that shows repeated attempts to enforce those limits. A voting record that reveals a nearly split Senate. And a set of public statements that carefully step around the one word that would force the entire system to confront itself. This is no longer about whether the resolution passed or failed. This is about whether the framework itself is being followed or quietly reinterpreted in real time. And this is the point where numbers stop being abstract and start becoming human. Because while Washington debates language, margins, and procedural authority, something else is happening far away from the Senate floor. Not in a chamber, not behind microphones, but in neighborhoods that don't get to vote on war powers. Reports indicate that more than 1,000 Iranian civilians have died as a result of these operations. Not senators, not strategists, not people writing legal memos about limited scope. Civilians, families, people who never stepped inside a policy discussion, but ended up inside the consequences of one. Now pause for a second and sit with that contrast. On one side, you have a chamber arguing over whether a resolution would limit flexibility. On the other side, you have human lives already limited, permanently. That's not a rhetorical contrast, that's a moral one. And moral contrasts don't disappear just because a vote fails. This is where the tone sharpens again, because the system isn't just being tested legally, it's being exposed ethically. Because when Mike Johnson says we're not at war right now, the implication is control, restraint, proportionality. But control looks very different from the ground. Control doesn't look like shattered buildings. It doesn't look like displaced families. It doesn't look like silence after impact. So the question isn't whether the operation is technically defined as war. The question is whether the people experiencing it have any say in how it's defined. And this is where the political insulation begins to crack. Because unlike legal disputes or courtroom battles that can be framed as partisan attacks, war doesn't stay inside partisan lines. You can argue about indictments, you can spin court rulings, but you can't reframe a body count. You can't spin a number like that into neutrality. And that's exactly why this situation is different. Because it forces a collision between narrative and reality. Now bring it back to the Senate. 47 senators voted to restrict presidential war powers. That's not just opposition. That's a warning signal from inside the system itself. Especially when one of those voices is Rand Paul, who isn't reacting to this moment, but applying a consistent principle across administrations. Congress authorizes war, not selectively, not conditionally, not when it's convenient. Always. So when that principle is raised in the middle of active operations and still doesn't change the outcome, it raises a deeper concern. Not about who is right politically, but about whether the principle still has force in practice. Because here's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath everything you've seen so far. The Senate didn't authorize the continuation of military action. It failed to stop it. And those are not the same thing. Failing to act is not the same as approving. But in real-world consequences, it can look identical. And that's where the ethical pressure builds. Because if civilians are dying, and Congress is signaling concern, and the operations continue anyway, then the system isn't just debating authority. It's absorbing responsibility. Quietly, incrementally, one vote at a time. And this is where the story stops being about a president or a party or even a single vote, and becomes about the system itself. Because systems don't collapse all at once. They bend, they stretch, they adapt to pressure, until one day the exception becomes the rule, and no one remembers where the line used to be. That's what you're watching here. Not a dramatic break, but a quiet redefinition. Go back to the numbers one more time because numbers don't lie, but they do reveal. 53 to 47, 52 to 47. That's not a mandate, that's a countdown. Because in the Senate, 3 or 4 seats flipping is not a theory, it's math. And math doesn't care about narratives. It doesn't care about messaging. It just waits for conditions to change. And then it changes everything. Now think about what that means in practical terms. 47 senators have already put their names on record twice saying that presidential war powers should be restricted. That record doesn't disappear. It doesn't reset after the news cycle moves on. It sits there, archived, time-stamped, March 4th, April 15th, 2026, waiting to be used. Used in oversight, used in hearings, used potentially in something much bigger. Because once a record exists, showing that Congress attempted to assert its authority and failed, not because it lacked concern, but because it lacked just a few votes, that failure becomes part of a larger narrative, not of control, but of erosion. And here's the part that should make people pause. The Senate did not clearly endorse expanded war powers. It simply could not stop them. That distinction matters more than anything else in this entire sequence, because a system that cannot enforce its own limits is not neutral. It's unstable. Now layer in the political reality. Public concern is rising. International criticism is growing. And inside the same chamber that appears unified from a distance, there are already visible fractures. Voices like Rand Paul stepping out of alignment, not for spectacle, but for principle. That's how shifts begin, not loudly, quietly, incrementally, until one vote turns into two, two turns into four, and suddenly the margin disappears. So, when people say the president won these votes, that's technically correct. But strategically, structurally, that's a different story. Because this wasn't a victory that closed a chapter, it was one that opened a countdown. He didn't secure control. He secured time. And time, in a system like this, is the most fragile asset of all. So here's the question that remains, clear, unavoidable, and uncomfortable. If the law requires authorization, if Congress signals that requirement, if operations continue anyway, is the law still functioning as a limit on power? Or has it become something else entirely, something that exists on paper, is debated on camera, but is no longer decisive when it matters most? That's not a partisan question. That's a system question. And the answer to it doesn't just define one presidency. It defines whether the structure itself still holds. If you've made it this far, you already understand this isn't just about one vote or one moment. It's about a pattern that's still unfolding. So I want to hear from you. Do you think the system is holding or quietly slipping? Drop your perspective in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of conversation that matters. And if you want more breakdowns that cut through the noise and stay focused on what's actually on the record, hit like, share this with someone who follows US politics, and subscribe, because we're going to keep tracking every move, every vote, and every shift as it happens.